Hi, everybody. I want to talk about an experience an American company negotiating a subsidiary in China had with their negotiating team overseas in China. And so these were the areas in which the Americans were most frustrated: decision making, contract discussions, self-management, and the use of interpreters. We'll take them one by one. When it came to decision making, they found that their Chinese counterpart, chief negotiator, was rarely at the table. This is, of course, a tactic because you can always defer decision making. I'm sorry, we don't have the authority. We have to run this by our chief negotiator, but he was never there. And the Chinese negotiating team, unempowered themselves, assumed that the Americans were unempowered as well, which they were not. They were authorized to make decisions right then and there. Also, when it comes to decision making, China is apparently, I've never been there, so I know I'm just speaking from what I've read, but you know, it's a heavily bureaucratic form of government. And there are district governors and local governors and mayors and all kinds of officials that have to come to an agreement and be a part of the decision-making process. And that was very difficult for the Americans to deal with because it was so complicated. Also, you know, we've talked about the importance of establishing rapport in a negotiation. Imagine working hard to establish rapport and then experiencing the delight of, yes, he and I or she and I on the opposite side of the table are on the same page. How wonderful. And then the next negotiation session, they're not there and they're not coming back because they're no longer on that team. This too is a tactic. And it put the Americans back on their heels because they had to now start over with somebody else from square one. And of course, every decision had to be tabled until the chief negotiator appeared. So there was no sense of progress. When it came to contract discussions, the Americans found, to their horror, that every clause and every word, including words that we take for granted, had to be discussed and defined, and that this process alone took 2 years. Now, if you love being in China or away from home and away from your family for 2 years, maybe that wouldn't bother you. For some of you, this would be hugely frustrating. Also, when it came to the contract enforcement, the Chinese wanted Chinese law. The Americans wanted a version of Western law, and they both settled on the Vienna Convention. Also, the Chinese suggested penalties for violation of a contract that were disproportionate. The Americans found that when it came to the contract negotiations, without an MOU, they were back to square one. MOU is a memorandum of understanding. This is an important negotiation tool for cross-cultural communications, negotiations in which communications are difficult. So you would want to, okay, well, we both understand this, sign here. At least you've made some progress to that point. Everything had to be couched in terms of win-win, mutual benefit. Now, I was told by one of my Chinese students that this is pronounced wee-wee. Of course, he may have been playing a joke on me. I have no idea, but mutual benefit was very important, as it is with us. We want a win-win as well. When it came to team management, the Americans were very, very frustrated. Negotiations took 5 years. Occasionally, they lost their cool. The Chinese were offended or acted offended when the Americans closed their briefcases and said, "The hell with this, we're walking out," at which time the chief negotiator on the other side would appear. This too, of course, is a tactic. The Americans learned when it came to the issues of interpreters that speaking Chinese was not enough, that the interpreter had to have a lot of expertise in international business and have technical knowledge, and would have to be able to read the body language, read the high context of the other side of the table. And of course had to be very familiar with the American position. So here are the lessons learned. Identify, and this applies to any negotiation, not just cross-cultural, because you could be wasting your time with, for example, this first one. If you're not just negotiating with the decision maker, I'm not going to suggest you're wasting your time, but you will be wasting your time if you expect decisions made at that time and that decision maker isn't there. You want to make sure he or she will be present. You don't want to assume a shared legal background with the people you are negotiating with, and you have to be prepared for the long haul. You want to frame everything in terms of win-win. If contract negotiations have to go over every single word, then you have to cut those words, get it down to the most essential. And then you have to use MOUs to nail down understandings on both sides. You've got to keep your cool. You have to allow timeouts, just like we talked about, or Yuri talked about, going to the balcony. Of course, you have to bring your own interpreter often. You can't assume. In other words, you don't want to rely on the interpreter provided by the other side. You can see how that could be a problem. Now, I just used a word a minute ago, high context, without defining it. Context means what is going on in the room. What is happening in the room? And it refers to relationships, even body language, social ritual, politeness. In a high context culture, these verbal elements are very important. I'm sorry, these non-verbal elements are very important. In a low context culture, they are not that important. These are high context cultures where the social relationships, the politeness, even the ambiguity is important. In America, so this is the problem with cross-cultural communications. Over there, I'm going to say over there from our perspective, things that are important to them that are unimportant to us. For example, in North America and in Europe, we don't care about the context. We want to spell everything out in black and white. Here's the contract. The contract represents everything. We don't care what the players feel towards each other. We don't care about the levels of trust per se. We don't care about politeness. I'm just cutting to the chase here. We care less about all that because we have the document that if a problem were to arise in the future, we can lay out on the bar of justice and say, Your Honor, look, they signed here, they initialed here, they understood here. So we live in a very low context culture. On the other hand, we're negotiating with somebody in a very high context culture. I want to go to Korean War negotiations very quickly because I just saw a PBS on this. And it was on the truce negotiations between America and the United States. Now, I know this happened a long, long time ago, but this is illustrative of how another culture really played us like a violin. The Chinese insisted on a location inside their territory, and that they, both envoys, Americans and Chinese, would have white flags. And then we would meet, the Americans met at a temple that had many stairs. So, of course, the Americans don't know about the many stairs. We're going to meet at the temple. Okay, we agree to all that. Here's what happened from a propaganda Chinese media perspective. The Chinese media showed Americans driving up with white flags, arriving as supplicants with Chinese troops in the background, which was a violation of the agreement, but we put up with it. Then the Americans had to walk up 200 stairs towards the Chinese victors, arms folded, looking down at them. And you can imagine how that played in China. Both sides agreed, by the way, that negotiators would be no higher than a colonel. What did that tell you? That tells you that neither side had decision-making authority. The Chinese changed their players continually, always going back to square one for the Americans. They would build rapport with somebody. This colonel, American colonel, got along with that Chinese colonel. They're friends. We understand each other. Then he's no longer there and never will be there because he's no longer part of the team. It took a year just to agree on the definitions of the terms. So you see, even though this took place 80 years ago or so, not 80 years ago, about 60 years ago, I guess, things have not changed that much necessarily. Now look at the U.S.-Iran nuclear negotiations. I always mispronounce that word. Nuclear negotiations, very, very similar. We went to them on their soil. Their media showed us arriving as supplicants, visitors from the most powerful country in the world. And by the way, one of the things that we read about was good guy, bad guy kind of team negotiations. I read accounts that the Iranian counterpart in these negotiations reportedly screamed at screamed at the top of his lungs at Secretary of State John Kerry. So you see, cross-cultural negotiations have been difficult for a long time up to the present. Okay, I'm going to stop here and go on to part 2.